Hey guys, let's talk about gas tanks. The size of the tank and the amount of gas that you need to carry depends a lot on the kind of riding you do. If you're riding a 4-stroke adventure bike and you're out on long haul rides, you need a big desert tank. If you're riding a 2-stroke in a race where you can refill frequently, you probably don't need a very big tank. In fact, you wouldn't want one. There's a balance between tank size and range and the weight distribution, especially the top heavy nature of the fuel weight on a bike. Now the stock tank on the 2018 Beta 390 that I have was originally 2.2 gallons, which was enough for something like 60 miles, fairly reliable range, depending a little bit on how I rode it. If I was on the throttle a lot doing steep hill climbs and things like that, it wasn't going to last nearly as long. If I was riding fire roads or street, highway, it was going to last a little bit longer than that. A lot of the rides that John and I do here on the Wannabes channel tend to be between 60 and 100 miles-ish, and it's not always easy to go and get gas along the way. So we wanted just enough to be able to get my Beta through to the end of those rides without having to worry about refueling. I'm going to show you how to install these tanks on the Betas, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about the experience that I've had with it, because there are a couple of things that are a little bit frustrating about the tank and a couple of things I kind of like. Let's dive in. With the new tank, 3.1 gallons, I'm getting about 90 miles fairly reliably on each ride. These new larger tanks have larger lobes that stick down. The EFI system only pulls from two places, one low lobe and one in the center. The other lobe has no fuel pickup, meaning that any of the fuel that's left in there that can't reach either of those two pickups I just mentioned is not going to be available for use. Now what happens when you ride typically is that gas sloshes around quite a lot in the tank and will end up splashing into the side where there is an EFI pickup and getting sucked up into the pressure system. If it doesn't, if you're riding gently and for some reason you end up with fuel left in there when you run out, you can lean the bike on its side, drain some of that fuel back over onto the pickup side, and it'll give you something like a reserve, which as we know these EFI bikes just don't have. But be aware that if you go with the black tank like I did, you can't see through it, and so it's really difficult to tell where the fuel line is in that tank without opening the lid, shining a flashlight or something down inside, trying to figure out how much gas is in the tank. Not a big deal in my case because I think the black matches the bike better. The other issue that I've had with this tank is that it doesn't quite fit the Kickstarter. IMS can be forgiven for this oversight since most of these bikes, at least the last couple of years, just don't come with a factory Kickstarter. I installed one on mine, so I'm somewhat in a minority. So IMS not figuring out that that didn't fit is really not a big deal. It's not a deal breaker. Let's show you how to get these installed. These IMS tanks come with all of the parts that you'll need for installation, plus a few stickers and an instruction manual. First step is to remove the plastics and remove the seat from the bike. Next, remove the bolts that are holding the stock fuel tank in place and remove the fuel cap breather hose. Gently lift the tank to one side so that you can disconnect the fuel pump hose, the power wire, and the fuel level sensor wires. Be careful while you're doing this with the quick connector on the fuel pressure line. They've been known to break. On some of the newer Betas, 2020 and 2021 I believe, guys are actually zip tying these connectors in place or replacing them as they're a prone failure point. To disconnect the fuel pressure line, press on the gray button to release the clip, and that fuel line will actually pop apart. Carefully drain the fuel from the old tank into a safe container. You can probably reuse it unless there was something wrong with your tank where dirt got into it. Next, remove the bolts that are holding the brackets for the fuel pump and the auxiliary pickup. You'll remove those brackets later from inside the tank after you get the wires out. Disconnect the internal fuel lines. This is quite hard to do without breaking. Beta has a special tool that you can use. I don't have that tool, so I eventually made do with a very small flathead screwdriver that I was able to slide inside the connector and individually release each of the 4 clips that are holding that connector in place. Disconnect the electrical wire and remove the 2 halves of the fuel pump system. They're going to come out separately. Be aware that these fuel lines probably have fuel still in them, and you'll want to drain that as soon as you get them out of the tank. Swap out the seat anchor screw from the old tank to the new tank. Insert the inner brackets back into their respective holes in the tank. I ended up initially just dropping them into the tank because they're quite hard to get in place, and then using a long pair of needle nose pliers to maneuver the screws on those brackets into the holes. Then put the screws on initially without any of the pumps attached, just to hold those brackets in place while you work on the fuel lines. Insert the lobe fuel pickup line and fish the connectors out of the main pump hole. Connect the main fuel pump pressure lines and the electrical connector. Attach the bolts for the fuel pump and the pickup. These are quite hard to get lined up. It helps to hold the brackets with a small screwdriver while you get those screws in place. Be sure to use the reinforcing brackets that come with the new IMS tank when you're reinstalling the pump and the lobe. Remove the fuel level sensor from the old tank and install it onto the new tank. One caveat here, be careful you don't damage the foam float, and check the condition of the O-ring and replace as necessary. Install the new IMS fuel tank bracket onto the back of the tank and insert the rubber grommet into the bracket.
So on a couple of versions of these newer betas, this wiring harness is actually routed over this cross member of the frame. And in order to install the new IMS tanks, you have to disconnect everything that connects on this wiring harness, pull the harness back, and route it underneath like they've done here.
Set the new tank on the bike so that you can reconnect the electrical and fuel lines. Install the rear fuel tank screw. Install the new front tank screws. I found it easier to remove the regulator in order to properly tighten the left-hand screw, as the regulator is in the way and doesn't allow you to get a screwdriver on properly. Next, reinstall the plastics. You'll need to cut away a little of your stock plastics in order to make them fit around the larger IMS tank. Install the gas cap and reinstall the breather tube. Thanks a ton for watching, guys. Really appreciate your time. If you like this video, please consider subscribing, and we'll see you next time.